in Massachusetts, as well as strategies to reduce harm in the moment and seek amends. We would like to name here that our material will inevitably fall short of covering the additional complexities and paying the full due of respect to the compounding obstacles that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and folks of different immigration status face whenever they encounter any part of the system. To this end, we would like to declare here our solidarity with the BLM, Defend the Police, and other forms of radical collective power and system undoing movements in full swing now, in the past, and in the future, and encourage everyone to ask hard questions here and beyond. We also declare understanding that the denser the oppressive intersectional knot, the greater its potential to open the door to a more total liberation. So now you'll see on the screen our participant biographies. Rachel is our lawyer and also a community member. Martha is our community member and will be sharing her expertise here from her lived experience and as a now trainer of the Alternatives to Suicide training team. On the right, you'll see those of us who are present as part of Wild Ivy: Zoe, Micah, Cora, Caroline, Tokyo, Beth, and myself, Celeste. We as the Wild Ivy team are present in the chat here, and we welcome you to interact with us as you like. Our event today will be broken up into two parts. The first 45 minutes will cover rights, process, and strategies from both a legal and a lived experience perspective. Rachel will offer us her legal expertise as both a legal practitioner and someone from our community. Martha will enrich the material by providing us with her lived experience both during and after. The last 45 minutes will be Q&A. So a quick note in terms of tech things. Oops, doesn't seem to want to. Oh no, aha. A quick think about tech things is one, this event will be recorded so that we may share it with others who did not have a chance to attend today. Everything about it will be kept anonymous. What you see on the screen in front of you is what others will see when we do the recording. So no one in the audience will have their face or their name shared. The chat also will not be shared, but the Q&A, especially those that are answered, will be. We're offering a post-event group tomorrow at the same time. That will absolutely not be recorded. That's in the interest of maintaining that as an open sharing space, since, you know, talking about Section 12 in any kind of direct or even indirect way is deeply personal and vulnerable sharing. So yeah, with all those brass tacks out of the way, we're going to go ahead and begin our event. I encourage you folks to engage with Caroline, Cora, and Micah over the chat as you digest the material, and to submit your questions for our panelists through the Q&A button along the bottom of your menu screen in the Zoom window. You will see that there's a Q&A option and a chat option. Please reserve the Q&A part for questions you'd like answered or submitted to our panelists in the last 45 minutes of this event. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and move us. Okay. Hi, everyone. Can everyone in the chat mention, note that you can see both Rachel and Martha? I can't. Okay. Okay. Let's see. What about now? Aha. Okay. And now? Nice. All right, Rachel, Martha, you're live. Martha, would you like to start us off by sharing a little bit of your experience with a Section 12 or encountering moments where you were at threat of a Section 12?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to share this. There's a few things I want to say up front. I've been hospitalized over 70 times. Fortunately, the last time was about 10 years ago. But I still see people today going through situations very similar to what I went through 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So I'm really glad to be able to talk about that. Only a small percentage of those 70 times were actually being sectioned. And some of them would have even been considered voluntary, because I went to the hospital, say, on my own, but there was always a degree of coercion in that. And often it was because I didn't know how else to get extra support that I needed. So I often felt like I really didn't have a choice. And I also want to call attention to the fact that I'm a white cis female who through most of this time had private health insurance. And that greatly affected how I was treated. And, part of that is I was treated poorly, but I was treated probably better than many. I also always had access to care. That was never an issue for me, that I couldn't access care, but it wasn't always the care I wanted. And sometimes it was forced on me when I didn't want it. So I can't even imagine what this would be like, for a person of color or someone that had fewer resources, both financial and people that supported me. I did have a small support network, but most of their support was to get me to go to the hospital, which was unfortunate. And I think they didn't know what else to do either. The final point I want to make right up front is that all of my involuntary hospitalizations occurred on evenings and weekends when my traditional support system, like my therapist or something, wasn't available to me. And I think that's a big problem with our sort of Monday through Friday normal work hours system of care. I wasn't often struggling between 8 and 4 on weekdays. All the situations I'll describe, I either did not know I had rights, and there was nobody ever explaining clearly that I did have rights and what they were. And even sort of later on, when I thought maybe I did have some rights, I didn't have any idea how to access them or any support to access them. I always felt like I was kind of alone, and versus all these people telling me what to do and controlling me. So I'll share a few experiences of the Section 12 sort of in different situations. And the first is like having people show up at my home or where I was living at the time to take me to the hospital because I'd been sectioned. This usually happened because I had called like my therapist or something and left a message that I was struggling, or even talked to her. But like I said, it was usually on an evening or on a weekend. And so I had a pretty good idea that someone was going to show up and take me to the hospital. And often she told me that she was going to do that, because she didn't want me to drive there on my own. But it wasn't ever really presented as a choice. It was kind of like, well, you need extra support, and so someone's going to come and take you. And by then, that the Section 12 was already initiated. I don't think I ever saw what it looked like or paper. I was just told it was there. And once someone came to my house, there was never anything I could say that made them say, okay, you're all right, we're going to leave now. Every time people came to where I was living, I got taken to the hospital, most often in an ambulance, but sometimes handcuffed in the back of a police car. There was a lot of embarrassment around this. One, it wasn't just, say, an ambulance coming. It was an ambulance, a fire truck, and the police. And sometimes multiple vehicles of each, descending on my home in my neighborhood. Sometimes my children were there, sometimes they weren't. And usually it wasn't an emergency. It wasn't that I had already done something to put my health in danger. So there was no reason for it to be kind of this emergency response with lights and sirens, but it always was, so all of a sudden I've got police, ambulance, and fire trucks with lights and sirens descending on my home. And I think it was just because my treatment team, who is usually my therapist or psychiatrist, thought I couldn't stay safe. So they did a Section 12. Early on, I cooperated with it. I really thought, well, they're doing what's best for me. This is what I deserve for saying what I did. And I just thought, this is normal. This is what should happen. Later on, I got a little more resistant to that and often gave them a pretty hard time verbally, but usually just by being sarcastic and making, comments about, asking them how they'd feel, if I did this to them. But it was always the same outcome, whether I was nice or not. I ended up in the hospital. I guess it did change, I was never physically aggressive, but I think even being verbally aggressive is how I ended up in handcuffs at times. Well, like I say, sometimes I went to the emergency room on my own, which, again, was an awful experience, because even if this whole idea of voluntary, nothing about this is voluntary. I might show up at that emergency room, but once I'm in that door, I'm not leaving just because I decide I want to leave. Usually in a room, like with some kind of security person at the door, with no one really talking to me, no one telling me what's going on, no place usually to lie down, no food, nothing to drink. Also, at the time, I was taking several medications, and during this period, they're not giving you any of those medications. And sometimes, it was always many hours, and at times it was over 24 hours. And so if I was in a little distress that caused me to go to the emergency room, 24 hours later, it certainly wasn't better. It was much worse. And I also experienced the restraints a lot, and if they didn't think you were cooperative, if that they perceived that I wasn't going to be cooperative, I was put in restraints. Sometimes in a hallway, sometimes in a private room, often accompanied with that was being drugged, with Thorazine and Ativan or some combination like that, against my will. There was no consent in any of this, no discussion of, no perception that I had any choice. This was something that was going to happen to me, whether I wanted it or not. And the other thing, that kind of gets to this whole voluntary thing, there was a situation where I was taken to the hospital in an ambulance, but as we got out of the ambulance, I tried to run from them, and I didn't get far. And so I was taken into the hospital, basically already restrained, and immediately put on a bed with restraints. And the first thing anyone said to me, a nurse came in and told me, if you sign this conditional voluntary paper, we'll take the restraints off. Otherwise, you're going to stay in restraints. And it's kind of like you're in that, you know, it's not a position where I felt I had any power, let alone, you know, rights or how to access rights. So, you know, those are kind of situations, and, you know, they're kind of general, but this happened to me over and over. And, you know, sometimes I wonder, why did I let this happen over and over? But it really wasn't until I got out of that cycle that I really started learning that I had rights. So I'm going to pass it off to Rachel.
Hi, thank you, Martha. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And my name is Rachelchunnha. I am a public defender in the mental health litigation division. I'm speaking for myself and from my own experience, which includes having been subjected to a substantial deprivation of liberty, what the law recognizes to be a substantial deprivation of liberty under Section 12 and probably 4 different sections of Chapter 123, the state mental health code. I later worked as a certified peer specialist, a crisis counselor, a recovery and rehabilitation counselor, and a human rights officer before deciding that my own calling to fight for justice and liberation was in the courtroom and defending people's rights as primarily a commitment defense attorney. So the first thing to know about Section 12 is that it's not a commitment. It's the primary route for involuntary civil commitment of an individual in Massachusetts, but it is not itself a commitment. So unlike being admitted to an inpatient medical facility for the treatment of say, like a purely medical condition, most psychiatric facility admissions are involuntary. So for example, in 2018, there were just over 69,000 admissions to DMH licensed mental health facilities. That's, you know, generally the private short-term acute stay facilities. And out of those 69,000, 50,500 were involuntary admissions achieved without any court involvement. So this really is the way that people get admitted to psych facilities. As Martha said, there really is nothing voluntary about it for the most part. It's, let's see. So I'll go through, there's several subsections of Section 12. 12A and 12B are probably what people are most familiar with, particularly if you've been subjected to a Section 12. They're documented on the same standard form that people colloquially call a pink paper. I know when I worked for an emergency services team, the attending psychiatrist just wrote her signature on the pink paper, and all of the clinicians had blank forms pre-signed by the clinician. Unfortunately, that's not uncommon. So Section 12A allows for a properly qualified physician, a psychiatrist, a psychiatric nurse, mental health clinical specialist, psychologist, an LICSW who, after examining a person, have reason to believe. So that's a really low standard, having a reason to believe that a failure to hospitalize a person would create a likelihood of serious harm by reason of mental illness. And so if they have that reason to believe, they're then authorized to restrain a person and apply for hospitalization at an inpatient facility. And so that's usually what leads to the transport, the involuntary transport of a person to an emergency department is the 12A. And if none of those designated professionals are available, a police officer who believes that the failure to hospitalize a person would create a serious likelihood of harm by reason of mental illness may also restrain a person and apply for their hospitalization. And typically that's accomplished by bringing the person to an emergency room for further evaluation as well. So the initial section 12A is the emergency restraint of a person. And by restraint, I should clarify, I mean a restraint of your liberty, not a physical restraint. And it's solely for the purpose of evaluation and seeking admission to a properly licensed mental health facility. And it could be the inpatient psychiatric unit attached to the hospital where the person is in the emergency department. So you're taken to the MGH emergency department under section 12A. You could be admitted under 12B to Blake 11 upstairs from the emergency department, or could be transported to another facility. You don't have a choice. So unfortunately, section 12A provides no time limit on how long that detention may last. And this is very recent case law from the state Supreme Judicial Court in the matter of CR. We had argued that that there's a 3-day limit, or that there must be some time limit, but the Supreme Judicial Court did not agree. So we are, if you yourself or anyone you know is being detained for an unreasonable amount of time in an emergency room under 12A or sequential 12As, when we want to know about that. A lawyer wants to know about that. Get on a phone, call people. But what happens after the 12A is the 12B. And it's the 12B that has a time limit attached to it under the statute, which is 3 business days. And so once a person is at the facility, once the 12B is signed, that's when the 3 business day time clock starts ticking. And that is strict. When no action is taken at the end of the 3 business days, a person must be discharged under law. This is strict, this is jurisdictional. A court does not have jurisdiction to hear a late filed civil commitment. I should note there is also section 12E, which is less known and less commonly used. Section 12E allows any person to go into the district court and apply for a commitment. So not all, apply for a hospitalization. So not everything happens through an emergency department. The standard, but going back to 12A and 12B, the standard is a little different for a 12B than a 12A. The 12A requires only a reason to believe that a failure to hospitalize a person would create a serious likelihood of harm by reason of mental illness in order to restrain the person and transport them for evaluation. The 12B requires an evaluation by a designated physician who then determines that the failure to hospitalize the person would create a serious harm by reason of mental illness. Let's see. And once the 12B is signed, once a person is admitted under a section 12B, the facility must inform the person deprived of liberty under 12B that they will, at the person's request, notify the Committee for Public Counsel Services, the agency I work for, the State Public Defender Office, CPCS, and counsel, a lawyer will be appointed. And the lawyer meets with the person at the absolute latest the next business day, because this is an emergency. And people who are admitted under 12B are presumed to be indigent, which means you don't pay for your lawyer. You have the right to a lawyer. You have the right to a court-appointed lawyer. And you can request a hearing for what's called an abuse or a misuse of the provisions of Section 12B. You don't have to wait the 3 days and wait out the 12B if the 12B was an abuse or a misuse of the provisions. And you have the right to request an emergency hearing in the district court that has jurisdiction over where the hospital is. You have the right to a lawyer. You have the right to be present. You have the right to be heard. It's not necessarily an evidentiary hearing of presenting evidence, but you have the right to a psychiatric examination, notification of the right to counsel, notification of the appointment of, you have the right to a lawyer, to meet with that lawyer, to confer with your lawyer. And the hearing happens pretty quickly, unless you or your lawyer requests a delay. So one note about 12E, I should say something about 12E, even though it's less common. This can happen in the district court, the municipal court, the juvenile court, where anyone can go in and allege to a judge that that the failure to confine a person would create a serious likelihood of harm by reason of that person's alleged mental illness. And after hearing that evidence, if the judge considers that evidence sufficient, the judge can issue a warrant authorizing the police to apprehend the person alleged to suffer from mental illness. And once the person is apprehended, they're brought to the court or another location to be examined by a designated physician or a qualified psychologist. But before that examination, the person has to be afforded the right to confer with a lawyer. And the lawyer, with the person's consent, can be present during that examination. The person performing the examination is required to inform the person that anything they say can and most likely will be used in court, that it's not confidential, that court-ordered examinations are not confidential. So rights. So the rights there, the right to be represented by counsel, written notice of the reasons the commitment is being sought, disclosure of the evidence against you, the opportunity to mount a meaningful defense, the opportunity to be heard in person, to present witnesses, including any independent experts, and documentary evidence, the right to confront and cross-examine witnesses, and a written statement by the judge as to the evidence relied on and the reasons for the commitment. And then if the court finds the evidence sufficient, the judge can order the 3-day commitment under 12E. So the length of time, regardless of which section 12 procedure is used, whether it's 12E or 12B, meaning like the more common pink paper route or the less common 12E through the court, it cannot exceed 3 business days. So 3 business days for all practical purposes can be much longer, particularly if it's a Friday, particularly if it's a long weekend. One of the rights is the right to a voluntary or a conditional voluntary status. Prior to admitting a person to a facility under Section 12, a person is supposed to be afforded the opportunity to apply for a voluntary or conditional voluntary admission under Sections 10 and 11. As Mark had described, it doesn't really feel voluntary most of the time. It could be a doctor saying, either you sign the conditional voluntary to get to the hospital, or you get to the hospital under an involuntary Section 12B. So that choice doesn't really feel voluntary. But they're different strategic reasons to choose one route or another. But a right that you do have is to be afforded the opportunity to consult with an attorney regarding which strategic choice is best for you in your circumstances, to meet your goals and minimize the length of your involuntary detention and minimize the amount of harm that you might be subjected to during the course of the admission. So that is absolutely a right to confer with an attorney prior to making that decision of whether it's going to happen. But when they say it's happening one way or another, you have the right to confer with an attorney to minimize the harm. So discharge. A person admitted under Section 12 can be discharged at any time during the 3-day period. So it doesn't need to last the 3 business days. It can, but it can also happen at any time prior to that. If someone doesn't sign the conditional voluntary, they must be discharged upon the expiration of the 3 business day period unless the facility files a petition for their commitment. And then if a commitment petition is filed, which is Sections 7 and 8, the person can then be detained in the facility longer pending a hearing on that petition. And the hearing must be commenced within 5 days of the filing unless the person and their attorney request a continuance. For all practical purposes, that means if the hospital files, you're talking about 12 days, for up to 12 days, taking Saturdays, Sundays, and potential legal holidays into account. Before the matter is considered before the court. And that's pretty much all there is to it, to Section 12. There's more about Section 10 and 11, like conditional voluntary admissions and strategic reasons for choosing that or for not choosing that and refusing to sign one. But that probably gets more into the second section of strategies or else individual circumstances and reasons why one choice might be better for someone in terms of minimizing harm, and not the right choice for someone else, and actually create more potential harm. So perhaps this would be a good time to move on to the second section. And I'll mute myself.
Hi, folks. Can you all see me? Okay, wonderful. Please let me know in the chat if you can see my screen. Thank you, Martha, and thank you, Rachel, for both of your expertise, for bringing in both things that are always happening at once during a really tense and really precarious moment where different kinds of, oh, interesting. What about now? Can you see me now? Ah, nice. Thank you, folks. I guess it's a collaborative effort. Thank you all. So yeah, as I was saying, my gratitude to both you, Rachel and Martha, for sharing your experience, your expertise. We're now going to move on to the open Q&A question, where I would encourage everyone in our audience to look down along the bottom, and where you see the Q&A portion, to please go ahead and begin submitting your questions. We'll be able to see all of them on this side. And if you'd like a specific panelist to answer your question, please go ahead and note that as well.
So Celeste, we've already got some going, so
beautiful.
I would be happy to share some of those.
Yeah.
And what we don't have time to answer, we will absolutely do our best to have answers to those questions in the emails people receive after the event.
Sounds good.
Martha, are you still there?
I am.
Okay. There you are. Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline. As Celeste mentioned before, I'm a co-director of the Wild Ivy Social Justice Network. And there are some amazing questions that people have submitted. So the first one that I want to ask you both, if you'd like, Martha, if you have experience around this, someone is asking about signing the 3-day notice. And whether there are any pros and cons to signing a 3-day with the Section 12 that you've experienced, or from a legal perspective.
I'm sorry, can I just say something about that? You can't sign a 3-day under a Section 12. You can only sign a 3-day if you're a conditional voluntary patient.
All right, great. So I think that cleared that up.
Oh, Caroline, I would actually also be interested in knowing what, just in general, a little bit outside of the Section 12, but definitely related, what are the pros and cons of signing that 3-day?
I know for me, this is Martha, I did sign 3 days many times, and I always retracted them before the 3 days was up, because I was treated horribly, and I was afraid if they decided to commit me, I would always lose. I didn't think there's any way I could win in a hearing. Some of the things that happened when I was in the hospital, all the hospitals I was in used a privilege system, that as you advanced, as they determined, you got more privileges. If you're there because you have suicidal thoughts or thoughts of self-harm, you have to lie to get privileges, because as long as you keep telling them, yeah, I'm still having these thoughts, you're going to be at a low level and not have any. But every time you signed a 3-day, you lost any privilege status you had. Like in those days, there was smoke breaks outside. Now there's supposed to be fresh air breaks. If you signed a 3-day, you didn't get that privilege. And it's not really a privilege, it's a right, but it's put to you as a privilege. And once you signed a 3-day, you could not go outside because they considered you a flight risk. Some of my hospitalizations were in the VA, which is a whole nother thing. They're not necessarily under Massachusetts law because they're federal, but they use Massachusetts law a lot. But in the VA, you have to wear VA pajamas if you have a certain, don't have a certain privilege level. And if you signed a 3-day, you could no longer have your clothes. You had to wear VA pajamas. If I signed a 3-day, my children were small, and often there was a rule that kids had to be a certain age to visit. And they always bent that rule. When I was quote unquote cooperative, if I signed a 3-day, they would say your children can't visit anymore. So, there was always this, and I was often told, well, here's the paper, you can sign it, we'll get you committed. It wasn't, and I was never offered the chance to talk to a lawyer, never once. And it's kind of the same with a conditional voluntary. I signed those because I thought I would always lose in a commitment. And, if I signed a conditional voluntary, then I just had to lie really well and I'd get out. So that's my experience.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. We have another question about healthcare proxies. So if someone has someone making medical decisions like in their stead, what would a healthcare proxy's role be in all this if I'm facing commitment?
So a healthcare proxy can't admit someone into a facility. But where a healthcare proxy does come into play is in a Rogers hearing in 8B. So if at the end of the section 12B stay, or at the end of the 3-day notice, and the facility does petition for someone's commitment, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. The hospital has the highest burden of proof, of proving beyond a reasonable doubt commitment. And then if they meet that burden of beyond a reasonable doubt and a person is committed, and you move on to the Rogers hearing, the section 8B hearing, and the person is found incompetent to make their own decisions regarding accepting or refusing medication, that's when a healthcare proxy would come into play and be sort of a defensive strategy against a court order overriding the healthcare proxy.
Thanks so much. So another question that we had, it's regarding the lawyer consult. The lawyer consult, when trying to decide whether to choose conditional voluntary versus getting a section 12. One person is asking, how long would this typically delay any type of evaluation process if someone is stuck in the ER?
If someone's stuck in an ER, it's probably not gonna delay anything because they're stuck there, right? But there are substantial rights that you give up when you sign a conditional voluntary. facilities, emergency departments and facilities like to talk about signing a CV, a conditional voluntary, as if it's some privilege they're giving you, but you give up substantial rights by signing one. And there are also certain risks, and you have the right to be informed about what rights you're giving up by signing a conditional voluntary and what you risk. And that's really an individual determination, a really like a harm reduction strategy, really, when you're facing an involuntary hospitalization.
Thank you, Rachel. So I have a question. I think it's a really great question that, that Martha, you two might be able to add like some insight to, for folks that have experienced institutional trauma, coercion, and force. Are there places that you recommend to go where you can get peer support, where you can speak to people that have had similar experiences? Oh, I think we lost Rachel. And have a non-judgmental place to talk about this type of trauma.
Yeah, for me, the only place I've found is like with the Western Mass RLC, with alternatives to suicide groups, even with hearing voices groups, and probably I haven't been to like the coming off psych drugs, but I think peer support groups that are connected to an organization like the RLC are the only place I've ever found where I can be comfortably totally open about my experience and not be afraid that if I share some big emotion, someone's going to think they need to step in and care for me. And that's, because even though supposedly these rights exist, I worked on an inpatient unit at Faulkner, which is part of Brigham and Women's. And it was kind of considered one of the most like recovery oriented hospitals. And, I would tell my supervisor there, who was a psychologist, if this is what we're saying is one of the best, we're in real trouble. Because the other thing I saw there, they would say things like, people don't have to take medication. We'll offer it to them. They can refuse. But almost every time I saw someone refuse medication, they filed for commitment. Almost every time. And they don't tell you that up front. They say you can refuse. But then they file for commitment. And that was my experience with the conditional voluntary. No one ever said what I was giving up. It was totally sign this or we'll commit you. And I thought they could do that. They got me to the hospital without listening to what I had to say. So I always figured I would lose in court. And, sometimes when I worked on the inpatient unit, when I'm talking to people, unfortunately, sometimes harm reduction was go along with them so you can get out of here. And then once you're out of here, we can work on how not to end up back here. And that's really sad because you're going somewhere for help because you need extra support. And it's really sad when help is trauma.
Thank you so much, Martha. Rachel, I think you might have missed the question. We were just asking, Martha was describing some of the resources that she has used to get support around some of these experiences, not necessarily legal support, but peer support from other folks that have had institutional trauma, experienced force. I will say that some of the resources Martha has spoken to are in the chat and they'll be shared after. Western Mass RLC resources. I was wondering, Rachel, since you're also a survivor of this type of trauma, like, were there any places that were helpful for you in getting support?
I, you know, I don't know what the Icarus Project is like right now, but many, many years ago, it was helpful to me. And the coming off of psych drugs guide and support was helpful to me. And there was a pretty active community in Boston and online at that time. I have no idea what it's like now. I was wondering if there's time for me to talk a little bit about conditional voluntaries, because there seem to be a lot of questions.
Totally. Yeah, there's a lot of questions about that and like what a 3-day notice is as well.
Exactly.
So that would be wonderful, Rachel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So, you know, people will say voluntary and conditional voluntary. And the thing is, the law allows for both. The law allows for a true voluntary and for a conditional voluntary, but in practice, facilities only accept conditional voluntaries. So you want to understand what that condition is that's being placed upon your voluntary will, right? When you're, it's called applying for conditional voluntary admission, even though, as Martha described, it can sometimes feel like forced upon you, not like an application, but something you're being required to do. A person is qualified to apply for conditional voluntary if they understand that they're agreeing to stay or remain at the hospital and accept treatment. And that they must give 3 business days written notice to the facility of their intention to leave. If they no longer wish to remain at the facility and accept treatment there. And that at the end of those 3 business days, the facility can then petition the court for their involuntary commitment. And they may be held at the facility until that time that the case is heard by court. And what people are talking about with like a 3-day notice is getting out from underneath a conditional voluntary. So that's the written notice. The form and content of the written 3-day notice is sufficient if it conveys an intention to leave the facility. It doesn't need to be any particular form. Often hospitals have their own forms for a person to sign, but it doesn't, the law doesn't require any specific form, just the written notice. And you have the right to assistance from the facility in submitting that notice. So after receiving that 3-day notice, the facility can retain the person for up to 3 business days, which again excludes intervening holidays and intervening weekends. So 3-day notice is kind of a misnomer because the 3-day period could really be 6 days, say. And it begins counting the day after the notice is submitted. And then the person must be discharged at the expiration of those 3 days unless they petition for the person's involuntary commitment. A person admitted under a conditional voluntary cannot be medicated against their will, nor can a person under a 12B, right, unless there's an emergency. So avoiding a forced medication order, goes into the calculation of whether it's more strategic to be a conditional voluntary patient or to remain involuntary. But in practice, a lot of times facilities will construe the willingness to accept treatment as specifically a willingness to accept medication, and specifically those medications recommended by whoever your attending psychiatrist happens to be at that facility. So being a conditional voluntary patient in practice doesn't necessarily protect your extended right to refuse medication.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Rachel. I have another question here around sexual assault on hospital units. Something that, you know, is something that I have experienced, and it is a terrible and horrifying thing. Folks are asking, what are the rights of someone that experiences sexual assault while sectioned or under a conditional voluntary? In those situations, does that person have the same access to reporting the crime, having a rape kit done, access to rape crisis services? And I'll also ask, like, would this also be a time for contacting like a CPCS attorney?
So you should have this, as a victim of a crime, you should have the same rights to report that crime, whether you're a patient on a medical unit or a patient on a psychiatric unit. And facilities have a licensing obligation to report to DMH any crimes that occur on their units. So I would suggest, you know, calling, you know, reporting to the attending psychiatrist, assuming it wasn't the attending psychiatrist who's the one who violated you, contacting the human rights officer, making a DMH complaint, contacting the Disability Law Center, Disabled Persons Protection Committee, those people, if the facility isn't taking your report of the crime seriously. Yeah. Awesome,
thank you. And yeah, definitely we will include the Disability Law Center in the resources that we send out. So there's kind of a big question that I see sort of floating throughout, being asked in a number of different ways. So I would love to involve you too, Martha, as someone, you know, who has lived experience, but has also worked for many years as a peer specialist. There are people asking how to be a better advocate. And I just want to acknowledge, we have people asking this question in, I think, many different ways, like as a peer specialist, as a clinician. We also have people asking this question in terms of like broader organizing, like asking, are there organizations that are challenging Section 12 and the complications that it has with constitutional rights to due process? So what I would just love is to hear from both of you, however you want to answer that question with all the experience that you have, to the people listening that are thinking, I want to do something about this. I want to provide support around people that are having this experience. What what might you say to them? What are some of the experiences you've had?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. This is Martha. For me, like working in peer support, if you work for quote unquote the system, for a clinical organization, there's policies that really, restrict what you can do to keep your job. And you have to really know, sometimes they try to lump this under mandated reporter, and this has nothing to do with mandated reporter. And it's important because mandated reporter is a law. Policy is just policy, and policy can change. But I think the best thing I found, and what finally helped me get out of this, was to find different language and to build a support system that would talk to me about what would help. This thing, like for me, I was usually hospitalized because I had thoughts of suicide or self-harm. This idea, I feel suicidal. Suicidal is not a feeling. That's language the system has taught us. And unfortunately, if I said, I'm really struggling today, I don't know what I don't know if I'm going to get through. And then people would say, well, tomorrow will be better. Oh, you can do this. But they weren't rushing to support me. And if I said, I feel suicidal, all of a sudden I had people paying attention, and calling it attention seeking. But, sometimes I needed attention. I don't think attention seeking is a negative. It's used very negatively, but so, part of it is educating, like me. How can I, instead of saying I feel suicidal, say, wow, I'm really overwhelmed. I can't take care of these 3 little kids by myself right now. And building a support system that can be activated by that. If it's just sitting with me for the day, if it's bringing a meal, if it's watching something silly on TV, I think our reaction as a culture is, oh no, this person's in danger, get them to the professionals. And unfortunately, our professionals aren't always real good at responding to this. When the response is take away my, any feeling of empowerment and control I have, I never left the hospital not thinking of suicide. I usually left the hospital thinking, I'll kill myself before I ever come back here. And that was just because I didn't think I could be treated that way again. So, but I never said that because I never would have gotten out of the hospital. And that's unfortunate. And I'm not saying that professionals, I've seen a psychiatrist and a therapist for many years. And they helped me with things. They helped me process trauma. They helped me deal with my guilt and shame around, childhood trauma. But when they were concerned about my safety, the force and coercion was their reaction, and that didn't make it better. So what finally made it better was learning I could use different words, and I could get supports that weren't professionals, that could actually support in the moment. And they're also not, those supporters aren't just there 8 to 4. They're there on the weekend when I need something. They're there. And that's really tough, because it's really tough to ask for help, and it's tough to find people that are willing to, say I can sit with these big emotions. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to sort of make that shift to be here for each other.
Thanks so much, Martha.
So I think I tend to think more about strategy, like community support around resisting commitment. because that's where most of my work is, than I do around community support to avoid Section 12. And I just want to start this part by saying Section 12 is absolutely terrible. There is no other class of disabilities where people are subjected to such a broad and sweeping deprivation of liberty, right? Other than psychosocial disabilities, or in a lot of cases, alleged psychosocial disabilities. You don't even need to have been diagnosed by a professional to be swept within the ambit of Section 12. You just need to be perceived as mentally ill, right? So Section 12 is terrible, right? But in terms of resisting a Section 12, I mean, Martha, I mean, those are incredible, wonderful, like, suggestions. And if all of that fails and you find yourself in an emergency department, having the business card of a lawyer with you helps. Having even just one person who's going to, who's going to pick up the phone at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday from the emergency department and show up and say, look, I am taking this person home. I know the phone number for the local emergency services team, and promise, say what you need to say and promise to call it if this person is unsafe. I will stay awake with this person. I will monitor this person. I will get them to their appointment tomorrow, whatever it is. But have a buddy, have someone like that who you can call from the emergency department to make it less likely that a Section 12A turns into a Section 12B. People tend to become my clients because they have no one, right? Like, it is exceedingly rare that I have a client who even has anyone in the community that they could stay with, that they want to call, that they want to have present for their hearing. And that community support makes all the difference. It is a lot harder for a judge to commit someone when the judge sees that that the person is surrounded by a community than it is when the judge thinks this person's all alone and I'm, in the hospital is the only one who is looking out for this person, right? And so something I think about is, I think some people are familiar with the idea of participatory defense, particularly those of us who are abolitionists are familiar with community participatory defense in the criminal defense context of whether it's like perhaps an aid in sentencing or where the community comes together with photos and stories and, testimony regarding this person and their contributions to the community. Or even if it's just when a case is called, right? Like when a political protester is arrested and they're being arraigned in court, people, as many people from the movement as possible show up. And when that person's name is called, when their case is called, ideally you get 50 people or more in the courtroom standing up when that person stands up. Because when the judge calls that person, they call the community and the community is implicated, right? And so to the extent to which we can have and participate in and build these networks of support, the less likely we make it that any one of us will be subjected to a deprivation of liberty, either in the emergency department or in court.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. I think that is so powerful about how ultimately, defeating systems is creating communities that are stronger than those systems. Mm-hmm. I see people in the chat saying that they will not be able to we wanted to have like a follow-up event to the event, but there's so much Zoom going on right now, like sometimes it's hard to choose. But I remember when we were planning this, the hope was, maybe people, would feel fired up about doing more community building, creating more spaces where folks can come together that have had this experience and talk about it, and envision like new ways forward. One of the things I'll say, like, when people often say like, what can I do? I just want to also honor that like being here is a really important step, because I think as peer specialists, I've worked as a peer specialist for many years, including in forensic settings. And it was so important for me to have some working knowledge of what people's rights were, because they weren't being told that by clinicians on that unit. And one of the things I did on the forensic unit was to have like a group, like a private confidential group, where we brought a lawyer, once a month, so that people could ask their questions. This was an attorney from the Disability Law Center did this. And it was like a really powerful group, because I think a lot of folks on the forensic unit associated lawyers with always being against them, and never like sort of being in their corner as someone that they could ally with to defend their rights. So I love, we're so excited that so many folks are here and envisioning new possibilities forward. So we do, how much time do you need at the end, Celeste? Because we have a few more questions, but I also want to honor our wrap up too.
Thanks, Caroline. For closing, I just wanted to remind everyone about our post-event group tomorrow at the same time, although I see in the chat that no need for a reminder, and to also note that we will be sending out a couple emails after this event that have a copy of the recording, have a lot of the information that's been shared now condensed into handouts and different accessible kinds of formats. Yeah, so if I would love, honestly, I would move away from the closing and then just keep on answering questions. I think that's the more important thing. Yeah.
Cool. So I've got a couple of kind of interesting questions on a similar theme, where people are asking, and I love this line of questioning. Do these same rights that are extended to people with, a medical condition such as, I don't know, cancer, are they extended to people that have psychiatric diagnoses? So a couple of interesting questions. One is about a recent ruling in February 2020. I guess a court ruled against a hospital in Massachusetts where a woman had said, I don't want you to x-ray, stop x-raying my body. This was not a psychiatric admission. But the finding was actually that the woman, because she was not heard, she was saying, stop. The finding was in February that she could charge that hospital, Brigham and Women's Hospital, with a medical battery charge. So a recent ruling, and a person was curious, like, would this ever have any sort of impact on Section 12? I guess what I'll ask, Rachel, is, have you seen some of these rulings around patients' rights in the non-psychiatric world? Has there been an influence, in this sort of world that we're talking about, like Section 12, involuntary commitment, involuntary interventions?
I mean, so the law is the same, that it's a medical battery to, it's battery, period, right? An unwanted touching, absent, an emergency or a defense to it. So yeah, you could sue the hospital. I mean, that's a civil suit. It's not going to be resolved quickly, and it's going to cost a lot of money, and it's not going to get you free anytime sooner. But yeah, you can sue for people hurting you. You can sue for people touching you. You can sue for people, you know, performing unwanted medical procedures against you, against your will, absent like an emergency or medical necessity. Yeah.
You know, one of the unfortunate things is often when we're in this situation, we're considered to not have the capacity to make these decisions. And, you know, and just the power imbalance that's there, you know, makes it so difficult. Like, who has the means to get a lawyer and file these suits? There was a lawsuit of a hospital in New York City, a class action suit a few years back, because they were people who were being admitted to the psychiatric ward were refusing blood work because they didn't want to get blood work, and the hospital was giving them like Thorazine and Ativan so they could draw their blood. And I remember seeing that as a class action lawsuit, but I don't know what happened. And I actually talked to that with a friend of mine that's a nurse, and she tried to argue with me about, well, they have to get the blood, you know, that's okay. And I'm just like, it's incredulous to me that people don't see that as a violation of human rights. It just, it's tough.
Yeah, thanks so much, Martha and Rachel. And yeah, it's very strange, like, you know, some of these lack of parallels. You know, another question that someone had asked was just about, does like a do not hospitalize order that some people have, you know, with certain medical conditions, like could that ever, does that order apply to a psychiatric hospital? I don't know if you have any experience around that.
No, because Section 12 requires there to be some sort of emergency situation. Massachusetts doesn't have psychiatric advance directives. You can have healthcare proxies. You can have you know, powers of attorney and whatnot. But you don't have the same like fundamental right to refuse psychiatric care the same way you have to refuse medical care. Yeah. You know, like, which sort of brings me back to the beginning, that almost all admissions are involuntary, whereas almost all, you know, medical admissions are voluntary, or people, you know, seeking medical treatment for pain or medical distress.
That in and of itself should say something that, you know, about, you know, what we're calling treatment, is that, you know, most people don't actually want this. And when are we going to look at that and ask the question, why? Thank you for that answer. Just a couple more resources to share. I know folks have been talking about Discord in the chat, the peer support server. One of our advocates, Val, they wanted me to share that there's actually an entire channel on Discord, the Unrestricted Minds channel, to talk about some of these issues around locked units, not only experiences that we have had, but also envisioning, you know, new ways forward, you know, building stronger communities that are stronger than systems. And so I just wanted to put in that plug. And yeah, so I think we're coming towards the end of our time. Rachel has put her contact information in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry. There was one other plug I wanted to make. The RLC, we also have a monthly meeting that for people that do peer support in locked units. Zoe, I think you're a part of that. If there's any information around that you want to share, I think that there's like a networking call on the Zoom platform as well. So I didn't want to forget to mention that, but again, we're gonna send out an email with some of that information. Another plug before we close, we have a phenomenal, Martha and Rachel, just phenomenal change agents. And I'm so honored that, we could have this conversation with you. We're gonna have next week another great panel of change agents that have done work around the Judge Rotenberg Center, where autistic people have experienced, institutional trauma, coercion, and painful treatments involving electric shock. We're going to have 2 autistic legal advocates, Lydia Brown, Sean Newmeyer, and that is going to happen next week on Wednesday evening. So we'll send out the info about that exciting event too. Thank you so much, everyone. Celeste, anything that you want to say in closing?
Just a thank you to everyone, not just our wonderful panelists, all of the team, but also folks like in the audience. You were so particularly helpful just by engaging with us and submitting your questions. And then also when I had questions about the video feed, you were all super helpful about that. So thank you very, very much for this beautiful collective event.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.